Hey, are you keeping up with the Hacker News ongoing issues with the Telegram channel? Some traffic got veered off to a different Discord channel. Actually, never mind. Let's talk about today's top stories. The Hacker News Weekly, where we dive into the stories that got the tech community talking. This week, we reviewed over 200 posts and handpicked the top 10 that sparked the most passionate debates and important conversations. From AI reality checks to open source drama, from mathematical curiosities to the fight for our attention spans, we've got a fascinating mix that really captures the zeitgeist of tech right now. What struck me most about this week's selection is how it reveals the growing tensions in our industry, between hype and reality, between openness and protection, between progress and sustainability. So let's dive in with a story that perfectly encapsulates these tensions. All right, so next up we have a really refreshing take from AWS CEO Matt Garman about AI replacing junior developers. He's calling it, quote, the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And honestly, this struck such a chord on Hacker News that it racked up over 1,600 points and more than 700 comments. You know what I love about this? Here's the CEO of AWS, a company that's literally selling AI services left and right, basically telling everyone to pump the brakes on this whole AI will replace entry-level workers narrative. And his reasoning is it's so practical and grounded. So Garmin makes 3 really solid points here. First off, junior employees are actually the cheapest labor you've got. Like, from a pure business perspective, why would you replace your least expensive workers with expensive AI tools and infrastructure? That's just backwards economics right there. But here's where it gets really interesting. He points out that junior developers are actually the ones most engaged with AI tools. Over 80% of AWS developers are already using AI for writing unit tests, documentation, code generation, even these agentic workflows we keep hearing about. The juniors aren't being replaced by AI, they're the ones actively embracing it and figuring out how to make it useful. And then the killer argument that really got the Hacker News crowd going. If you stop hiring juniors today because you think AI can do their job, who exactly becomes your senior engineers in 10 years? Garmin literally asks, how is that going to work when 10 years in the future you have no one that has learned anything? It's this massive pipeline problem that apparently a lot of companies just haven't thought through. The discussion thread is fascinating because you've got all these developers chiming in with their real-world experiences. Multiple folks are saying, look, LLM-generated code is often this verbose, insecure mess that doesn't understand design patterns. One commenter mentioned, it only really works for small, well-defined problems, the exact kind of problems juniors are usually tackling anyway while they learn the ropes. There's this great analogy someone made to academia. You can't just skip from being an undergraduate straight to tenure, right? You need those years as a grad student, as a postdoc, building up not just knowledge but judgment and intuition. Same thing in software development. Now, there was one contrarian view that caught my attention. This commenter, Fabio YY, basically argued that juniors weren't worth it even before AI came along. Their take was that juniors consume too much senior developer time and then leave once they're trained up, so combining them with LLMs just makes it worse. It's a cynical view, but I guess some companies do think this way. What really resonated with me, though, was this discussion about foundational knowledge versus critical thinking. Someone brought up the Swedish education system as this cautionary tale. Apparently, they pivoted hard toward teaching reasoning skills over facts, and now they're dealing with the consequences of students who can't actually reason effectively because they don't have the base knowledge to reason about. And that's exactly what we're talking about with junior developers, isn't it? You can't critically evaluate whether AI-generated code is good or bad if you've never written code yourself. You can't architect systems if you've never built the components. You can't debug complex problems if you haven't made those mistakes yourself first. There was even this wild suggestion that instead of expecting corporations to be responsible about this, we should just extend education so everyone enters the workforce at a senior level, and then tax the companies that benefit from not hiring juniors to pay for it. I mean, it's creative, I'll give them that, but it kind of misses the point that real-world experience is what creates senior developers, not more schooling. You know what strikes me most about this whole discussion? It's that we're watching this tension play out in real time between short-term thinking and long-term sustainability. Companies looking at their next quarter's expenses might think, great, let's cut the junior positions and use AI. But Garmin's basically saying, hey, that's like eating your seed corn. Sure, you'll save money now, but what happens to your harvest in a few years?
And honestly, the fact that this message is coming from AWS, from inside the tech establishment rather than from some outsider critic, that gives it real weight. This isn't some Luddite saying AI is bad. This is someone whose company is deeply invested in AI's success, saying, look, let's be smart about how we use this technology. Let's not break the fundamental systems that create skilled developers in the first place. Speaking of companies making big bets on AI, let's look at what's happening at Meta. All right, so our next story has the tech world buzzing. Mark Zuckerberg freezes AI hiring amid bubble fears. And wow, did this one light up Hacker News with nearly 900 comments. Now, I'll be honest, we couldn't access the original Telegraph article, but the community discussion alone tells a fascinating story about what's really happening at Meta and, maybe more importantly, what it says about the entire AI industry right now. So here's the thing. When you first read that headline, you might think, oh, Meta's pulling back on AI, but the reality is way more nuanced. Several commenters who seem to have inside knowledge are saying this isn't really a freeze at all. It's more like Zuckerberg is reorganizing the entire AI operation under this new umbrella they're calling superintelligence, which, I mean, that's quite the name, right? They're apparently consolidating teams and being more strategic about who they hire, rather than just throwing money at every AI researcher with a pulse. And speaking of throwing money around, there's this incredible thread in the comments about Meta's compensation strategy. Apparently, they've been paying some star AI researchers over $100 million. $100 million. Can you imagine? One commenter made this brilliant point. For that kind of money, you could hire literally hundreds of really talented engineers at, say, $500K each. The debate gets pretty heated about whether having one superstar is worth more than having a small army of very good people. But here's where it gets really interesting. The community is absolutely roasting Zuckerberg's track record of expensive pivots. Think about it. First, there was the mobile push when Facebook almost missed that boat entirely. Then billions poured into the metaverse, which, well, we all know how that's going. Then there was that brief crypto flirtation, and now it's all in on AI. One commenter called it strategy by FOMO, and honestly, that's pretty brutal, but maybe not entirely unfair. The deeper you dig into these comments, though, the more you realize this isn't just about Meta. There's this growing anxiety about whether we're in an AI bubble that's about to pop. Multiple people are pointing out that companies are running these large language models at a massive loss. Like, the economics just don't work yet. OpenAI is supposedly burning through cash. Anthropic needs constant funding rounds. And even with all of Meta's resources, they're giving away their models for free because, well, nobody's really figured out how to make serious money from this stuff yet. One particularly insightful comment talked about the exponential growth in compute costs. They're saying that to get to AGI, if that's even possible with current approaches, we might need computing resources that would cost more than the GDP of entire countries. It's like we're trying to brute force our way to intelligence by just making the models bigger and bigger. But there might be a wall we hit where it's just economically impossible to go further. Now, in fairness, there were some defenders in the thread. A few people compared this to when BlackBerry ignored the iPhone, or when Kodak dismissed digital cameras. They're arguing that even if the metaverse was a miss, Zuckerberg's right to keep swinging for the fences, because missing the next platform shift could be fatal for a company like Meta. And you know what? They might have a point. Facebook's entire business model depends on being where people's attention is. And if AI assistants become the new interface for everything, they can't afford to not be there. But then you get these really thoughtful technical discussions about whether LLMs can even lead to AGI at all. There's this fascinating debate about whether we're just building really sophisticated pattern matching machines that will never actually understand anything, or whether understanding emerges from sufficient scale and complexity. Some folks are saying we need entirely new architectures. Others think we just need to 10x or 100x what we have now. The whole thing reminds me of the dot-com era, honestly. You've got massive investment, unclear business models, everyone's afraid of missing out, but nobody really knows which companies or approaches will actually survive. The difference is the stakes feel even higher this time. We're not just talking about pet food delivery websites going bust. We're talking about the fundamental future of human-computer interaction and maybe even intelligence itself.
What really struck me, though, was this one comment near the bottom of the thread. Someone pointed out that while everyone's debating whether this is a freeze or reorganization, whether AI is a bubble or the future, Meta is still quietly spending tens of billions on AI infrastructure. They're building massive data centers, buying up every GPU they can get their hands on. So maybe the real story isn't about hiring at all. Maybe it's about a shift from acquiring talent to acquiring compute. And if that's true, well, that tells us something pretty significant about where Zuckerberg thinks the bottleneck really is. While the big tech companies are figuring out their AI strategies, there's also fascinating innovation happening in the open source AI space. All right, shifting gears here, our next story is about DeepSeek v3.1, and this one's generating some serious heat on Hacker News with over 750 points and a pretty lively debate in the comments. DeepSeek just dropped what they're calling a major upgrade to their AI model. And honestly, the approach they're taking here is genuinely fascinating. So here's what's really catching my attention. They've built this hybrid inference system that's basically two models in one. They're calling it think and non-think modes, which, okay, the naming could use some work, but the concept is actually pretty clever. You've got one model that can switch between deep reasoning when you need it, that's when you hit their deep think button, and quick standard responses when you don't. It's like having a sports car with an eco mode and a race mode, except for AI reasoning. Now, what makes this interesting is how different this is from what OpenAI is doing with their O1 models. OpenAI basically built separate architectures for different types of reasoning, but DeepSeek is saying, nah, let's just make one model that can do both. And according to their benchmarks, the think mode is actually faster at reaching answers than their previous reasoning model from May. They're claiming big gains in thinking efficiency, which, if true, that's a pretty big deal for anyone building AI agents or tools that need to solve complex problems. Speaking of agents and tools, that's clearly where DeepSeek is placing their bets. They've specifically post-trained this model to be better at tool use and multi-step agent tasks. They're showing strong results on things like SWE bench and terminal bench, which are basically tests for how well an AI can do actual software engineering tasks. One commenter noted they're hitting 66% on SWE bench compared to Claude's Sonnet 4's 67%, so we're talking competitive performance here. But here's where the community discussion gets really interesting. The hardware requirements for running this thing locally are, let's just say, ambitious. We're talking 250 gigabytes or more of RAM or VRAM. That's not exactly something you're running on your laptop. Though, I've got to give credit to the community. They're already sharing GGUF implementations and optimization strategies, trying to make it work on more reasonable hardware. The pricing strategy is where things get really aggressive, though. They're charging $0.56 per million input tokens and $1.68 per million output tokens. And they're locking that pricing until September 2025. That's incredibly cheap, like almost suspiciously cheap. It's clear they're going for market share over profit right now, which makes sense when you're competing against OpenAI and Anthropic. But, and this is a big but, the performance reviews from actual users are pretty mixed. One person in the comments said it hallucinates more than any model they've used in the past 6 months, which is not great. Another user mentioned that despite all the hype about the hybrid inference approach, they're finding it 10 times slower and 3 times more expensive than comparable models like GPT-OS 120B. So there's definitely a gap between the marketing pitch and what some people are experiencing in practice. What's also interesting is that they've removed their off-peak discount, which was a nice feature for developers who could schedule their workloads. And while they're supporting 128K context windows, which is solid, we're seeing other models push even further these days. The open-weight nature of this model is definitely winning them points with the community, though. They're releasing 840 billion parameter models freely, that's a lot of parameters to just give away. It's a bold strategy that's clearly aimed at building developer mindshare and ecosystem lock-in rather than immediate revenue. You know what this reminds me of? The early days of cloud computing, when Amazon was practically giving away AWS services to get developers hooked. DeepSeek seems to be betting that if they can get enough developers building on their platform now, they'll figure out the monetization later. Whether that works in the AI space, well, we'll see. The hybrid approach, though, that's what I keep coming back to. If they can really nail this idea of one model that seamlessly switches between fast responses and deep reasoning, that could be a game changer for how we build AI applications. Imagine not having to choose between speed and accuracy, but being able to dynamically adjust based on the task at hand. That's pretty compelling, assuming they can work out the kinks that users are reporting.
Now let's talk about how AI is creating new tensions in the open source world. All right, now we're diving into something that's really stirring the pot in the open source world. AI tooling must be disclosed for contributions. This one's got the Hacker News crowd fired up, with over 700 points and more than 400 comments. And honestly, I can see why. So Mitchell Hashimoto, who maintains the Ghosty terminal project, just dropped what some are calling a controversial new policy. He's basically saying, look, if you're using AI to generate code for your pull requests, you need to tell me. And the reactions have been all over the map. Here's the thing that makes this fascinating. Hashimoto isn't some AI hater. He actually uses AI tools himself, says he appreciates them when they're used with what he calls heavy supervision. But he's drawing a line in the sand because he's seeing too much of what he bluntly calls slop. AI-generated code submitted by people who don't really understand what they're submitting. Think about it from his perspective for a second. You're a maintainer. Someone submits a pull request, and you spend hours going back and forth, coaching them, helping them improve their code, only to realize you're essentially teaching an AI system through a human proxy. That's time you could have spent actually improving the project or helping genuine human contributors learn and grow. He actually frames undisclosed AI use as rude and even suggests maintainers are being tricked into these situations. What really caught my eye in the discussion threads was this whole legal angle that people brought up. Apparently, there's this thing called the Developer Certificate of Origin that a lot of projects use, and AI-generated code might not legally qualify. Some commenters are pointing out that AI could be spitting out verbatim copies of code from its training data, which creates this massive IP headache. One person basically said accepting AI-generated contributions could be an existential risk to open source projects. That's pretty heavy stuff. But here's where it gets really interesting. Not everyone's on board with this policy. Some folks are asking where exactly you draw the line. Is GitHub Copilot's autocomplete AI? What about your IDE's intelligent code completion? One particularly sarcastic commenter suggested we should disclose if we used spell check too, which, okay, I get the point they're making, but it feels like they're missing the forest for the trees here.
There's this fundamental tension happening between two camps. On one side, you've got maintainers who are drowning in low-quality submissions and want transparency to manage their time better. On the other, you've got developers who see AI as just another tool in their toolkit, no different from Stack Overflow or autocomplete. One comment that really stuck with me compared this to asking a contractor if they outsourced work offshore or used 10,000 monkeys typing away. Their argument was basically, Who cares how the code was produced if the human submitting it takes responsibility for it? But then that assumes the human actually understands what they're submitting, which is exactly what Hashimoto says isn't happening. The social dynamics here are fascinating too. Open source has always had this mentorship component, right? Experienced developers helping newcomers learn the ropes. But if you're actually just refining AI output, that whole social contract kind of breaks down. Hashimoto put it pretty beautifully when he said helping human contributors improve is an achievement to be proud of, but that same effort isn't warranted for pure AI submissions. You know what this really reminds me of? It's like we're watching the open source community grapple with its identity in real time. Is it about the code, or is it about the community and human learning? Can it be both when AI is in the mix? And honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer here. The genie's out of the bottle with AI coding tools. They're only getting better, and more developers are using them every day. But at the same time, maintainers are already overwhelmed, and if AI is making their job harder rather than easier, something's gotta give. What Hashimoto is doing with Ghosty might just be the first of many projects implementing similar policies. Or maybe the community will push back and find a different way forward. Either way, this feels like one of those moments where we're defining the norms for the next era of software development. Pretty wild to watch it happen in real time, isn't it? Speaking of open source projects and the challenges they face, let's look at something that's been making waves in the world of knowledge preservation. All right, so our next story is about Anna's archive and a pretty significant update from their team. And wow, this one really struck a nerve in the community. Over 1,000 points and more than 500 comments, which tells you right away that we're touching on something people care deeply about.
So, Anna's archive calls itself the largest truly open library in human history, and honestly, that might not even be hyperbole at this point. They've been on this massive preservation mission since 2022, and the scale of what they're doing is just mind-blowing. We're talking tens of millions of books, scientific articles, documents. They've scraped content from Internet Archive's Controlled Digital Lending Program, HathiTrust, DuxU, and they've even created what they're calling the largest book metadata collections in history by scraping WorldCat and Google Books. The reason they're scraping metadata is actually pretty clever. They're trying to figure out which rare books still need to be preserved. It's like they're creating this massive inventory of human knowledge and then systematically filling in the gaps. They've partnered with LibGenForks, STC Nexus, zLibrary, basically building this distributed network of knowledge preservation. But here's where it gets interesting and a bit controversial. The team is reporting increased attacks on their infrastructure, and there's this whole drama within the piracy and preservation community itself. They're warning about something called WeLib that's apparently using their code but not contributing back, and there was this mysterious disappearance of a LibGen fork. It's like there's this underground tension even among the people who you'd think would be on the same side. The Hacker News discussion around this is fascinating because it's overwhelmingly supportive, but not in the way you might expect. People aren't just cheering for free stuff. They're sharing these really personal stories about how Anna's archive has helped them. There's this recurring theme where people use it as a discovery tool and then actually go buy physical books. One commenter talked about finding obscure titles on Anna's archive and then hunting them down in local bookshops. Others are talking about how it fills these critical gaps, when volume 3 of a series is mysteriously unavailable anywhere, or when you need a specific edition for research that's been out of print for decades. And then there's this absolutely wild point someone brought up about Meta. Apparently, they scraped 80 terabytes from these shadow libraries to train their AI models. No compensation, no acknowledgement, just took it. Meanwhile, governments are going after services like Anna's archive. The hypocrisy there is pretty stark. Now, there were some dissenting voices, and I think it's important to hear them out. One commenter, Computer Dork, made this argument from the creator's perspective. They pointed out that the music industry went from $35 billion in 1994 to $29 billion in 2024, and they're attributing at least part of that to piracy, devaluing creative work. It's a fair point, right? If everyone's getting content for free, how do creators eat?
Another user criticized Anna's archive specifically for scraping from Internet Archive's controlled digital lending program, suggesting they're actually hurting legitimate preservation efforts. And that's a complex ethical question. Internet Archive is already in legal hot water, and if Anna's archive is making their situation worse by scraping their content, are they really helping the cause of knowledge preservation in the long run? But what really comes through in these discussions is the sense that Anna's archive has become essential infrastructure for a lot of people. Researchers in developing countries who can't access journal subscriptions, students trying to find textbooks, people just trying to read books that their local library doesn't have. The technical achievement here is also worth noting. They're not just hosting files. They're building these sophisticated metadata systems, creating discovery tools, maintaining distributed mirrors. It's a serious engineering effort, and they're doing it while under constant attack, both technical and legal. You know what strikes me most about this whole situation? We're at this weird inflection point where the traditional models of publishing and distribution are clearly broken for a lot of use cases. But we haven't figured out what comes next. Anna's archive is essentially a hack, in the truest sense of the word, a workaround for a system that isn't serving everyone's needs. Whether you see them as pirates or preservationists probably depends on whether the current system works for you or not. And speaking of systems trying to block access, here's a particularly bizarre example. Next up, we've got a story that perfectly captures the absurdist theater of modern web security. Why are anime catgirls blocking my access to the Linux kernel? And yes, you heard that right. Anime catgirls are now standing between developers and the Linux kernel infrastructure. And this rabbit hole goes way deeper than you might expect.
So here's what happened. A security researcher was trying to access git.kernel.org, the official repository for the Linux kernel, the foundation of basically every server on the internet. And instead of code, they got an anime catgirl avatar staring back at them. This is Anubis, which its creators describe as a hybrid art project/network countermeasure. And honestly, that description barely scratches the surface of how bizarre this whole thing is. The way Anubis works is genuinely fascinating in its perversity. It completely inverts the traditional CAPTCHA logic we're all familiar with. You know how CAPTCHAs are supposed to be easy for humans, but hard for computers? Well, Anubis does the exact opposite. It presents you with a challenge that's computationally trivial, but literally impossible for a human to solve without writing code. Specifically, it asks you to brute force SHA-256 hashes with leading zeros, basically Bitcoin-style proof of work. Imagine being asked to manually calculate millions of hash functions in your head just to view some kernel documentation. It's like asking someone to prove they're a human by doing something only a machine can do. The Hacker News discussion on this, and we're talking 893 comments here, so clearly this struck a nerve, reveals some really interesting tensions in how we think about web security. There's this fascinating split between people who see this as security theater and those who argue it's surprisingly effective. One commenter, John Close, made a point that really stuck with me. They said, look, if it worked for even a little while before being circumvented, that's still better than nothing. And there's something to that, right? In the constant arms race of web scraping, even temporary protection might be worth it. But here's where it gets really interesting. Several experienced developers in the thread pointed out that most AI crawlers and scrapers are shockingly unsophisticated. Like, we imagine these AI companies with their billions in funding have these incredibly advanced scraping systems, but apparently they often don't. They're using off-the-shelf tools, respecting robots.txt, backing off at the slightest resistance. One commenter argued that custom, simple anti-bot measures, even something as silly as animate catgirls, work precisely because they're not worth the engineering effort to bypass at scale.
The irony here is just chef's kiss. We're using cryptocurrency mining techniques, the very thing that's been criticized for wasting computational resources, as a gatekeeper for accessing open source code. And the people best equipped to solve these challenges? The AI companies with massive compute resources that the system is supposedly trying to block. Meanwhile, someone trying to clone the kernel repo from their Raspberry Pi or an older machine is just out of luck. What really caught my attention in the discussion was this debate about whether blocking crawlers even makes sense for Linux kernel infrastructure. I mean, this is supposed to be open source, right? The whole philosophy is about accessibility and transparency. But then you've got the practical reality that aggressive crawling can take down servers, especially when it's poorly implemented bots hitting the same endpoints thousands of times per second. There's this comment from a user called Equivinox that I think nails the real issue here. They argue it's not really about stopping crawlers entirely, it's about preventing what they call identity scattering. Basically, these AI companies spread their requests across thousands of different IP addresses and user agents to avoid rate limiting, and that parallel crawling is what actually brings servers to their knees. The proof of work challenge forces them to serialize their requests, at least somewhat. But then you've got to ask yourself, is this really the future we want, where accessing public code repositories requires solving cryptocurrency puzzles while staring at anime characters? It feels like we're entering this weird new phase of the internet where the open web is becoming increasingly hostile to actual users in the name of protecting against bots, while the bots themselves are getting sophisticated enough to bypass these measures anyway. The whole thing reminds me of that classic XKCD comic about security, where you make things so secure that nobody can use them anymore. Except here, we're making things so human-only that only machines can pass the test. It's security through absurdity. And somehow, it might actually be working, at least for now. All right, so moving on to something that's got the developer community absolutely buzzing. FFmpeg 8.0 just dropped. And folks, this is a big one. They're calling it Huffman, and with nearly 1,000 points on Hacker News, it's clear this isn't just another incremental update.
FFmpeg is one of those tools that's just everywhere. If you've ever watched a video online, converted a file, or streamed anything, there's a really good chance FFmpeg was involved somewhere in that pipeline. It's like the Swiss Army knife of media processing, except imagine if that Swiss Army knife could also fly and make you coffee. And version 8.0, this might be their most ambitious release yet. The headline feature here, and this is genuinely groundbreaking, is they've introduced Vulkan compute-based codecs. Now, I know that might sound like technical jargon, but here's why this matters. Traditionally, if you wanted hardware-accelerated video encoding or decoding, you needed specific chips with specific capabilities. Your GPU had to have the right decoder built into the silicon. But with these new Vulkan compute shaders, any GPU that supports Vulkan 1.3 can now handle these tasks through general-purpose compute. It's kind of democratizing hardware acceleration. Right now, they're supporting FFv1 for both encoding and decoding, and ProRes RAW for decoding. And yes, before anyone asks, there's been some healthy skepticism in the comments about how well this actually works. One commenter pointed out that FFv1 uses arithmetic coding, which is inherently sequential, so getting massive GPU speedups might be trickier than it sounds. But still, the fact that they're even attempting this shift is fascinating. But that's not all. They've added native decoders for a whole bunch of formats. Real Video 6.0? Yeah, Real Video is still a thing, apparently. ProRes RAW, which is huge for video professionals. And they've made significant improvements to VVC, that's versatile video coding, which is basically the successor to HEVC and might be how we're all watching 8K videos in a few years. If we ever actually need 8K videos. Here's something that really caught my eye, though. They've integrated OpenAI's Whisper model as a filter. Think about that for a second. You can now run speech recognition directly in your FFmpeg pipeline. Want to automatically generate subtitles while you're encoding a video? Boom, it's right there. The convergence of traditional media processing with AI capabilities, it's happening right inside FFmpeg. The community reaction has been, well, it's been like a love letter to FFmpeg. Multiple people are calling it critical infrastructure, comparing it to SSL or SQLite in terms of how fundamental it is to modern computing. And honestly, they're not wrong.
One commenter mentioned they use FFmpeg in their smart doorbell project, another in their vintage film digitization workflow. It's literally everywhere. But here's the thing that keeps coming up in the discussions. FFmpeg's command line interface is notoriously complex, like legendarily complex. Several people admitted they now just ask ChatGPT or Claude to generate their FFmpeg commands because remembering all the flags and options is basically impossible. One person joked that FFmpeg's command line is write only. You can create the command, but good luck understanding what you wrote 6 months later. You know what really strikes me about this release, though? It's the longevity and consistency of FFmpeg. This project has been around since 2000, and it's still innovating, still pushing boundaries. In a world where tech projects come and go, where companies pivot every few years, FFmpeg just keeps being FFmpeg, solving problems, supporting every format under the sun, and apparently now bringing GPU compute to the masses. The Vulkan stuff is particularly interesting because it could signal a shift in how we think about hardware acceleration entirely. Instead of waiting for Intel or NVIDIA or AMD to add support for the latest codec in their next generation of chips, developers could potentially just write compute shaders. It's more flexible, more democratic, and potentially more future-proof. There's still questions about performance, about how well this approach will scale, about whether it can match dedicated hardware, but the fact that FFmpeg is pioneering this approach, that's the kind of technical leadership that keeps this project relevant after nearly 25 years. And with almost 200 comments on Hacker News, it's clear the developer community is paying attention. Now, let's look at what note-taking apps are doing to stay relevant in this new AI-powered world. Now, here's something that's got the Obsidian community pretty fired up. We're talking about Obsidian Bases, which just went public and is stirring up quite the debate with nearly 700 points and over 250 comments on Hacker News. So Obsidian, if you're not familiar, has been this beloved Markdown note-taking app that's really carved out its niche among people who want to own their data and keep everything in plain text files. And now they've rolled out this feature called Bases, which is essentially their take on database functionality. But here's where it gets interesting. It's all still built on top of Markdown files.
The community reaction has been, well, let's call it mixed, but passionate. On one side, you've got folks who are absolutely thrilled because this basically replaces DataView, which, if you don't know, has been the plugin for doing database-like queries in Obsidian. People have been using DataView to create these complex dashboards and reports from their notes, but it required learning this whole query language. Bases makes a lot of that functionality accessible through a visual interface, which is huge for less technical users. I'm seeing people talk about using it for personal CRMs, tracking their D&D campaigns, managing project notes, media libraries. One user mentioned they're tracking their entire TV show watch list this way. The possibilities are pretty extensive. But here's where the controversy comes in. And honestly, I think the critics have a point. The way Bases works is that each item in your database needs to be its own Markdown file. So if you're tracking, say, 500 TV shows you've watched, that's 500 individual Markdown files. One user, Def Polygon, really went off about this, saying it's completely inefficient compared to just using a spreadsheet or SQLite database. And they're not wrong. Creating hundreds of tiny files for what could be rows in a single table does feel a bit excessive. There's this deeper philosophical debate happening too. Some users, like H. Resselger in the comments, are arguing that this goes against what makes Obsidian special. They're saying Obsidian's strength has always been as a Markdown editor for long-form writing and connecting ideas, not as a database tool. Their argument is basically, if you want Notion, just use Notion. And they worry that by trying to be everything to everyone, Obsidian might lose what makes it unique. The counter-argument from the Obsidian fans is that this keeps everything in Markdown, which means you still own your data. It's still portable, still works with version control, all those benefits that drew people to Obsidian in the first place.
Plus, they point out that nobody's forcing you to use bases. If you want to stick with pure markdown notes, you absolutely can. What I find fascinating is this tension between two different philosophies of data organization. You've got the traditional database mindset, where data should be normalized, efficient, stored in tables, and then you've got this document-based approach, where everything is a file, everything is human-readable, everything is portable. Obsidian is trying to bridge these two worlds, and whether that's brilliant or misguided really depends on your use case.
For power users who've been wrestling with data view queries, this is probably a godsend. For people who just want to write notes and link them together, it might feel like unnecessary bloat. And for folks who need serious database functionality, well, they're probably still better off with dedicated tools. The timing is interesting too, because we're seeing this broader trend of note-taking apps adding more and more features. Notion added AI, Rome added multiplayer, and now Obsidian's adding databases. It's like every app is trying to become the everything app for knowledge work. Makes you wonder if we're heading toward convergence or if users will eventually push back and demand more focused tools. Sometimes the best innovations come from pure curiosity, not for business plans. All right, so our next story is something that really captures what I love about the programming community. Show HN, I was curious about spherical helices, ended up making this visualization. And wow, did this one strike a chord with people, pulling in 849 points and 132 comments. You know how sometimes you wake up with a random question stuck in your head? Well, this developer woke up one morning wondering about spherical helices, basically how spirals wrap around spheres. And instead of just Googling it and moving on like most of us would, they built this incredible interactive 3D visualization tool that teaches you how objects move through 3D space. What I find fascinating here is the journey. The developer admits they started with no clear end goal, just pure curiosity. They write, "It stuck with me long enough that I ended up diving into a few articles about it. From there, it spiraled into lots of explorations." And honestly, when's the last time you saw someone build something substantial just because they were curious about something? Not for a startup, not for their resume, not for monetization, just because they wanted to understand something better. The visualization itself is pretty clever. It starts you off with the basics. Here's a dot moving in a circle controlled by simple cosine functions. You know, x equals 10 times cosine of pi t over 2, that kind of thing. Then it gradually builds up the complexity. Circles become spirals, spirals become these wild, chaotic patterns, and before you know it, you're actually understanding the math behind 3D movement in a way that no textbook could ever teach you.
But here's where it gets interesting. The Hacker News discussion reveals this real tension in how people received it. On one side, you've got folks absolutely loving it, especially those who connected it to real-world applications. Several commenters pointed out that spherical helixes aren't just mathematical curiosities. They're actually super important in navigation. Rhumb lines, loxodromes, the whole reason Mercator projections work the way they do, it all comes back to these patterns. One commenter even shared this beautiful historical connection about how sailors would use these concepts to maintain constant compass bearings across oceans. Like, imagine being on a ship in the 1600s, using what's essentially a spherical helix to navigate across the Atlantic. That's the same math this person was playing with on a random Tuesday morning. But, and there's always a but with Hacker News, not everyone was impressed. Some users found serious issues with the implementation, performance problems on certain browsers, visual effects that apparently gave some people headaches, and then there's this whole pedagogical debate that erupted. Several commenters argued that the visualization actually fails at its educational mission. One particularly critical comment pointed out that it makes too big a leap from "here's a circle" to "here's chaos theory in action" without properly building the conceptual bridge for people who don't already have the mathematical background. They're saying it's backwards pedagogy, showing the pretty pictures without really teaching the underlying concepts in a structured way. And you know what? Both sides have a point. The visualization is undeniably cool, and for people who already have some math background,
it's probably a great way to solidify their understanding. But if you're coming in cold, trying to learn what a spherical helix actually is, yeah, you might leave more confused than when you started. There's also this interesting technical critique about constant speed movement that several mathematically inclined commenters picked up on. Apparently, the way the visualization handles velocity isn't quite right for teaching certain concepts, which, look, I'm not going to pretend I fully understand the math there, but it shows how even a well-intentioned educational tool can inadvertently teach the wrong lessons if the implementation isn't perfect. What strikes me most about this whole story, though, is what it represents about the state of programming today. Here's someone who followed their curiosity, built something purely for the joy of understanding, and shared it with the world. No pitch deck, no monetization strategy, just, hey, I made this thing because I was curious. Maybe you'll find it interesting too.
In an era where every side project seems to need a business model, where developers are constantly told to build their personal brand or launch their startup, there's something refreshingly pure about someone just exploring mathematics through code because they woke up wondering about spirals on spheres. And the fact that it sparked such passionate discussion, both positive and negative, shows there's still a hunger in the tech community for this kind of exploratory educational content. Even with its flaws, even with the performance issues and the pedagogical debates, this project reminded 849 people why they got into programming in the first place. Sometimes that's worth more than perfect implementation. And finally, let's look at how developers are fighting back against the very platforms they once embraced. All right, moving on to our next story, and this one really struck a chord with the Hacker News community. Show HN. I built an app to block shorts and reels, sitting at 685 points with over 300 comments. And honestly, I think this perfectly captures the frustration so many of us are feeling right now. So here's the deal. Someone built ScrollGuard, an app that does exactly what it says on the tin. It blocks those endlessly addictive short-form videos on Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, and YouTube. And the response? Well, let's just say people are very interested in reclaiming their attention spans. What's fascinating here is that we've reached this point where developers are literally building apps to fight other apps. It's like we're in this weird arms race between platforms trying to hijack our attention and tools trying to protect it. The creator also included this anti-scroll mode that can set limits on any app, not just social media, which is pretty clever. Now, here's where it gets technically interesting and a bit frustrating if you're an iPhone user. The Android version is ready to go, but on iOS, the developer straight up admits they can't block Reels and Shorts the same way because of Apple's restrictions. They're working on, quote, a different approach, which, reading between the lines in the comments, probably means they'll have to use Safari extensions or some other workaround. It really highlights how Apple's walled garden affects even apps trying to help users. The discussion thread is where this gets really juicy, though. People are angry about how these platforms operate. One commenter pointed out that Instagram gives you a 30-day snooze option for suggested posts instead of letting you permanently disable them. 30 days, like they're just waiting for you to forget and slip back into the algorithm's clutches. YouTube's even worse. Multiple people mentioned how it completely ignores your not interested feedback and just keeps serving you whatever drives engagement. There's this great comment thread about alternative solutions people have tried. Some folks are using browser extensions like Unhook for YouTube. Others have gone full nuclear and switched to RSS feeds or self-hosted solutions. One person even suggested just using web browsers instead of native apps entirely, which, fair point, but also kind of defeats the purpose of having a smartphone, doesn't it? But here's the trust issue that kept coming up. ScrollGuard needs accessibility permissions on Android to work properly, and people are understandably nervous about granting that level of access to a closed-source app. I mean, accessibility permissions can basically read everything on your screen. It's this perfect example of the privacy functionality trade-off we keep running into. What really got me thinking, though, was this one comment that basically said, "Why do you need an app for self-control?" And look, on one hand, yeah, personal responsibility and all that. But on the other hand, these platforms employ literal teams of neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists to make their products as addictive as possible. It's not exactly a fair fight, is it? The whole thing reminds me of those old pop-up blockers from the early 2000s. Remember those? We needed third-party tools to make the web usable because websites got so aggressive with their pop-ups. Now we need third-party tools to make social media usable because the platforms got so aggressive with their engagement tactics. History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. What's wild is that this is a show HN post, meaning someone built this as probably a side project, and it's addressing a problem that billions-dollar companies have created and have zero incentive to fix. The fact that it got nearly 700 points shows just how desperate people are for solutions to this problem. We're literally downloading apps to protect us from other apps we voluntarily installed. If that's not a sign that something's broken in how we design digital experiences, I don't know what is.
And that wraps up our deep dive into this week's top hacker news stories. What strikes me most about this collection is how it reveals the tech community at a crossroads. We're questioning fundamental assumptions about AI's role in our industry, fighting to preserve the open web while protecting it from abuse, building incredible tools while simultaneously building defenses against the tools we've already built. From AWS's CEO warning us not to break the developer pipeline, to developers creating visualizations out of pure curiosity, to the ongoing battles over who gets access to knowledge and how we protect our attention. These aren't just technical discussions. They're conversations about values, about the kind of future we want to build, and about who gets to participate in building it. The fact that these were the stories that rose to the top out of over 200 posts this week tells us something important about what the community cares about right now. It's not just the latest framework or the hottest startup. It's the bigger questions about sustainability, accessibility, and whether the systems we're building are actually serving us or if we're serving them. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the week's most thought-provoking discussions. Until next time, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe keep an eye on those anime catgirls blocking your kernel access. This is the Hacker News Weekly, and we'll see you next week with another curated selection of the stories that matter most.